It's time to translate the science, data, and research behind dairy cattle genetics into real-world applications for farmers around the globe. Brought to you by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, the CDCB CowCast begins now. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CDCB CowCast. I am your host, Katie Schmidt, and we have a special guest joining us today. We are leaving the CDCB family and inviting Jay Weiker, president of the National Association of Animal Breeders, to join us for this episode. So welcome to the show, Jay.
Thanks, Katie. Good to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And we're going to start with a little bit of background on who NAAB is. Can you explain for viewers and listeners what it is you all do? Tell us a little bit about your membership and kind of paint that picture for us around U.S. artificial insemination trends.
Yeah, so NAAB is a trade association, and we represent the bovine semen industry. Basically, NAAB has three different types of regular members. We have members that are the commercial companies that most of us are fairly familiar with that produce and market semen. Then there are custom collection centers where all they do is produce semen for others to market. And then there are semen marketing companies. So semen marketing companies own the bulls, and then they have their semen custom collected at one of the custom collection facilities. And then to get to these statistics, all of our members are required to submit quarterly reports for units that are produced and units marketed. And the units marketed and custom collected for non-members are then aggregated and shared with the members and the public. And that's how we generate our sales statistics for the industry. And then about 4 to 5 years ago, our members started reporting some supplemental information, which includes breakouts for other semen types, like conventional versus gender selected, as well as beef on dairy versus beef on beef. So we've got several years now of good statistics and trends on those categories. And we estimate that about 99% of the semen that's exported from the US is produced by an NAAB member because they would have to be a CSS participant. And then we estimate that about 95% of the semen used in the USA is produced by an NAAB member.
In other words, you guys have a pretty good handle on semen usage and production here in the US, where it's going. And I love that there's more details about the types of semen produced so that we have a really nice holistic picture of what that use looks like in our herds here in the States.
Right.
Jay, before we jump into the statistics, you used an acronym. I just want you to explain for our listeners as well with that CSS. Can you say who that is or what it is that part of the business does?
Right. CSS is an acronym for Certified Semen Services. And the AI industry is self-regulated. They always have been. CSS started about 45 years ago. And the reason we started was that the government wanted to regulate the health testing at the AI centers. And the AI industry prefers to be self-regulated. So we started the CSS program with support of USDA APHIS. And we conduct annual audits of all the production centers. We conduct audits to assure that the proper health testing is being done, that the bulls have come through the system through pre-isolation, isolation, and into resident herd status. And then they've kept up and maintained their twice a year health testing as required by CSS. And we do have a memorandum of understanding with USDA APHIS that they accept the CSS audits as validation for export to markets that don't require an APHIS audit. So markets like the EU require a USDA APHIS audit, so we don't do an EU audit. But for most other countries, Africa, Latin America, Asia, most of them will accept the CSS audit.
Okay, I think that's helpful because it's part of the service you all provide as
Exactly.
a subsidiary or a sister kind of organization, right?
Right. And
All right,
CSS
so
is a wholly owned subsidiary of NAAB.
thank you. That's the relationship.
Correct.
There we go. So let's get
Correct.
into the numbers, Jay, because I think that's what listeners are really interested in hearing. So in 2025, you all at NAAB reported that the total number of semen units sold was 45.8 million. Now that was down about 6% from the year prior, but 24 had exceeded 2023 numbers by about 4%. So it comes out in the wash, right?
Right.
Now, that 45.8 million number, it's encompassing all domestic sales, exports, and custom collected units. Can you walk us through what each of those categories means and what share of the total each contributes to, and what does the typical year look like for those different categories?
Sure. Yeah. So domestic sales include all conventional and gender selected dairy semen units that are sold to producers in the USA, and that any sales by any regular member. And so just under 17 million units were sold domestically. And that represents about 37% of all dairy semen sold in 2025. The exports represent units that are produced in the USA and then exported to other countries. These units would be produced at a CSS audited facility to be eligible for export, just like what we were talking about just a minute or so ago. And in 2025, the export volume was about 28 million units, and that represents about 63% of the total dairy units sold. Now, the custom collection for non-members represents units that were produced for other bull owners that are not NAAB regular members, and they don't report any sales statistics to NAAB. So that's how we actually are able to capture those units that are produced for non-members, so we have a better handle on actual semen sales and usage in the US. And then in the past 4 to 5 years, the amount of dairy semen used in the US has declined. So the percentage of semen being exported has increased. So dairy semen exports continue to be a very, very important market for our commercial members.
Yeah, and the domestic side of this, you all show a slight increase in those sales numbers from last year,
Right.
which, as you mentioned, it's been down in the past. So, is there any indication of what might have contributed to that reversal or stabilization even?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it's contributed to semen usage and reproductive programs on the US dairy farms. They've changed dramatically over the last 5 years or so. And dairy producers are constantly evaluating how to manage their breeding programs to maximize their economic return. So, as we've all heard about beef on dairy, with the increased use of beef semen in dairy herds, there's actually been a corresponding decrease in the availability of dairy replacement heifers, right? So, when the quantity and price for replacement heifers is more profitable than breeding with beef semen, this causes a shift. And the export market is also looking for heifers to import into their country. And so there's more demand domestically for replacement heifers, which increases the demand for domestic dairy semen. So I think it's all related to how many heifers are required for US replacements, fill export markets. If there's a shortage, then they shift a little bit and start using more dairy semen to create more replacements.
I just saw a report this morning that was talking about the replacement market being the lowest that it's really ever been, or at least in recent years, with that
Yeah,
heifer population so constrained. So it makes sense then that we're seeing that reflected on the sales side of this as well, in producers
right.
wanting to make more dairy heifers at the end of the day,
Exactly.
even though those beef half blood calves are worth so much on day one.
Exactly.
Now,
Exactly.
related to all of this is the gender selected component of our semen usage, and it remains the most sold type of dairy semen that's used by producers. And last year, that category grew about 6% and now represents 64% of the dairy units sold domestically here in the US. Have you heard from your members about what's causing that explosion in demand for these units in recent years, and maybe it's some of what we're already talking about here.
Well, exactly. This ties into my previous comment about generating more replacement heifers. Producers are obviously genomic testing a lot of their cows and heifers, so they know which animals they want to use to generate replacement females or heifers. And so then these higher genomic and genetic value animals are being bred using gender selected semen so that they can accurately generate the appropriate number of replacement heifers. And additionally, the feedlots prefer beef crossbred calves as the males from dairy herds. So there's less demand for a purebred dairy steer. And so this reduces the domestic demand for conventional semen. And all these things I think are contributing to the increase in gender selected semen.
Do you see the gender selected semen increase on the beef side as well, but for male calves, or are producers more or less using conventional beef semen to make those crossbred calves?
There's quite a bit of gender selected male beef semen to go into dairy herds. Yeah, that's
Okay.
correct.
And speaking of beef semen, that's where we're headed next here because you also represent those beef semen suppliers and members. Now, beef units sold for use on dairy farms or use in dairy animals held constant, but it was still the number two category behind gender selected semen. So it's actually outpacing that conventional dairy by 2.1 million units. So, an interesting piece of the report that you shared, Jay, is discussing this heterospermic semen, where the sperm of multiple bulls is included in one straw. We see this mostly with beef units, with it being the third most common category of beef semen sold, following Angus and then crossbreds. And it's actually second in 2024. So, can you talk about the value of this heterospermic semen and those doses and why there's such a strong adoption of that packaging of beef semen?
Yep. Yeah. Well, your assumptions are correct in that heterospermic semen is mostly used for beef semen, and it's more specifically beef semen that's going to be used in dairy herds. If you've been following some of the major dairy publications, there have been quite a few articles written recently about heterospermic semen and why it's growing in popularity. If we look at the important points for a dairy producer that's using beef semen, they've got three main criteria. One is they want high conception rate with very high fertility semen. They want calving ease, and they're looking for a black-hided calf. And so the first one I mentioned there, semen fertility, that's a key factor. And so the fertility of a bull can be influenced by a lot of different factors. And for a bull, some days are better than others for semen production. So the benefit of using heterospermic semen is that you reduce the lows and maximize the highs. That means if one bull in the group is having an off day with semen quality, by mixing that semen with other bulls, the other bulls compensate for that. And it may look fine under a microscope. Motility may be fine, everything else may be fine, but maybe there was heat effect or he spiked a fever at some point before the semen was actually produced. And that's not something that would show up on a microscope. So, depending upon the study that you read, mixing of the semen with other bulls may not increase the fertility of the group, but it typically is close to the highest bull in the group. So, as mentioned, it evens out the conception results with fewer of the valleys. All right. So you've got more bulls in that to compensate for a bull that's maybe having an off day. And then for dairy producers, knowing the sire of the calf that's destined for a feedlot is not that important.
Mhm.
So the bulls in the heterospermic straw would be selected for growth and efficient meat production traits. So any of the bulls in that group would result in a desirable crossbred calf. But if for data collection purposes, if sire ID is important, the calf can always be genomic tested to verify the sire of the calf.
That's quite the conundrum on our end, right? When we want to think about
Yes,
those genetic features and how do we predict what beef bulls are going to lead to the most productive cross calves for producers when there isn't an ID attached to those calves. That's not something we can even dream about doing. So
right.
there's maybe a balancing act that we have to rectify in our minds of what's actually best for ourselves as producers or as an industry as a whole. And maybe it's some of both. But you did mention, Jay, this heterospermic technology or process is mostly used in beef. You say mainly, which leads me to believe that there is some use on the dairy side too. Is that the case?
There is some, but it's very, very small.
Okay.
It's not even really enough to count. It's mostly beef on dairy.
Okay. Okay. I just
And
wanted to
and and
check, right? Is
yeah, and I think with the calf identification, in time, if the cost of parent verification comes down and it's simpler and cheaper, then it might be something that could be done more routinely just to capture that data once that calf is born.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Which would have to be a decrease in genomic testing or genetic testing, right? Because the
Right,
CDCB side of that is pretty minimal on the parent verification.
right.
But yeah,
And
absolutely.
then we need to have an arrangement with the breed associations that have those genomics available to figure out the parent verification part of it.
Yes, yes, we are the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, not beef cattle breeding.
Correct.
So
Correct.
we do have some constraints there. So when we think about combining beef and dairy units, there's still a decline in total sales, even as the national dairy herds hold steady, and now we're
Right.
building it back. We know dairies are doing a better job with reproduction, both from a management perspective and selecting for more genetically, right? Is there
Right.
perhaps a female fertility component to this trend? We just simply don't need as much semen to get cows pregnant anymore.
Well, Katie, I think there's several factors that influence this trend. So first, I would agree. I would agree that producers have been selecting for female fertility, and the modifications that are going to be made with the female fertility trait models will show that there has been genetic progress for female fertility. So I think that's adding to the decline in the amount of semen used. Additionally, AI companies have been placing a higher emphasis on selecting bulls with positive DPR and female fertility traits. So producers have good selection options for these traits. And the third factor I would throw in that mix is that AI companies continue to research ways to improve semen quality, either through bull health or in the lab. So semen marketing companies survive when their customers achieve good pregnancy results. If low results are achieved, they're likely to change suppliers. So there's a strong motivation for semen companies to provide a good product. In cases where there's no growth in the cow population, these factors do result in fewer units required to get cows pregnant. It's just a fact. It's a mathematical fact.
Right, right. If you're
Yep.
you're doing a better job, you're actually losing some of your market if you're an AI
Right.
company.
Right.
Um,
Putting
so it just
ourselves out of
makes less
business.
product. Yeah, but keeping dairymen in business. So we like to see that
Right.
happen.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and you mentioned the changes in models for the fertility traits, and I just want to do a quick plug here for people who are joining us for this episode, but maybe missed Taylor's episode where we talked about those changes in the reproductive performance traits that are coming in August. That is the previous episode of the CDCB CowCast, so you can go back and listen to that and learn more about what it is Jay mentioned there with those changes in those models. But yeah, it's an exciting time, and I think one of the things that Taylor mentioned on the last episode as well is the low heritability of female reproductive performance traits,
Yep.
which means that anything that's not heritable, it's influenced by management and the environment and every other factor out there. So it's interesting that you bring up the semen quality as well as one of those external factors. It is not genetic related that we're not measuring in those traits.
Right. Right.
I'm going to go back to the beginning because it broke apart the semen sales from a domestic and an export and then a custom collected. And I wanted to focus in a little bit on those export numbers. And I'm curious to know if you all have a good sense for why there is such a strong international demand for US produced dairy or beef semen in this case.
If we go back to the early days of semen exports, we can go back to when we started exporting semen was back in the probably the early 1960s. And at that time, the markets were really North America, Canada, Mexico, Central America. They were early adopters of US genetics. Europe followed on in the 1970s, and then other countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand opened up to imports somewhere in the mid 1980s. And then countries like Vietnam and China, they started importing semen closer to around 2000, late 1990s to 2000. And then you have some markets such as Saudi Arabia. They've been importing heifers for going back to the 80s. They were importing a lot of heifers from the US, and they've always consistently preferred US genetics. So US genetics have established a good track record internationally, as well as they've built strong networks around the world to support their international dairy producers. And these producers have been using genetics imported from the US for several decades and have had good results. Many of these good producers are genomic testing their females today, just like US dairy producers, so they can maximize their genetic progress and profitability. So basically, success leads to success. They've been using US genetics for many decades, have had good success, and they're going to continue to use US genetics.
Now, you mentioned that they're using genomic testing on their females. Does it also mean that they are following that similar path that the US has gone down with more sexed dairy semen than conventional dairy semen, or even the beef on dairy market? Does that exist in those foreign markets as well?
Well, that's interesting. It may be surprising, but the ratio for exported dairy semen is just the opposite of the domestic market. So roughly 2/3 of the exported dairy units are conventional, and only 1/3 are gender selected, just exactly the opposite as the domestic market. And the reasons vary depending and according to the markets. Um, Many markets still do not have some of the same economic factors driving their breeding decisions as we have in the USA. So they can still use conventional semen, which is at a more affordable price. And they also may have a market for the purebred dairy calves going into their feedlots. So I think a lot of that is feedlot preference driven, where in some countries it's not as critical. They will take a Holstein or a Jersey animal or brown Swiss into their feedlot, or they have a market for it. But as pressure increases on all dairy producers to be more efficient and profitable, we do estimate and predict that more countries will follow the US trend by using more gender selected products along with beef semen on the bottom end of their genetics.
Okay, so they might be following our lead here in the coming
Yep.
years. And you also talked, Jay, about those countries that have a traditional relationship with the US and have built that relationship over the decades. But
Yep.
if we think about today's biggest customers when it comes to US genetics or dairy genetics, who would be the big players today and how has that changed in recent years?
Yep. Well, typically the top 10 countries remain fairly stable, although they may juggle and shift a little bit in their order or ranking. Typically, they stay in the top 10 or close to it. The exception would be in 2025 with China. In February of 2025, China closed their market for imported semen from the USA, and our members had shipped maybe 2 months worth of semen, but then there's been nothing shipped in the last 15 months. So when that occurred, China was the number one market for volume and dollar value in 2024, but it dropped to number 15 in 2025. And if they don't reopen the market, which it's not open right now, and there's no signs that it will, it's likely they won't even be on the export list in 2026. So if we look at the top 10 markets by dollar value, the UK would be the number one, followed by Italy, Mexico, Russia, Brazil, Canada, France, Japan, Australia, and Poland. And these have been consistently strong markets for US genetics over the decades.
Or kind of your usual suspects in the mix
Right,
there.
right.
So with the Chinese market going away in the last 15 months, but the export numbers are remaining stable. So that means that we're finding a home for the rest of that semen. So there's growth then in other countries. Am I kind of picking up on that correctly?
That is correct. Not all the units found a home somewhere else, but our members have been very resourceful and they've increased unit sales in many, many other countries. Our members export to over 120 countries around the world. And there are over 40 markets that have imported over $1 million worth of products in 2025.
That's great. So let's think a little bit about some of those challenges that US companies are facing in those international markets. What are they beyond kind of this unique Chinese situation, and how are they being addressed?
Currently, our exporters, our members are dealing with quite a few different issues, a lot of which are geopolitical factors. And most of these are out of our control. Some countries we're noticing are taking a little bit more of a market protectionist approach and encouraging the use of domestically produced semen versus imported semen. So there's always that struggle there to find that right balance. What they sacrifice is that they may not make as much genetic progress, but the intent is really just to help balance trade. To deal with this, some of our members are looking at where they should actually be producing the semen. So having bulls housed in different countries reduces some of that risk associated with the trade barriers. It just increases your logistics challenges. But then the other thing is NAAB, part of one of our responsibilities, or one of our main responsibilities, is dealing with international trade barriers and keeping markets open. So we do have an international program director. The main job is dedicated to reducing or eliminating these artificial trade barriers to open new markets and keep existing markets open. So NAAB's role is to help keep these markets open so that our members can actively work and sell product in those countries.
Sure. And let's bring it back to the domestic side as we start to kind of wrap this up, Jay. What are some of those trends you're seeing continue to develop here in the States in the coming years? Like, what can we expect if you look into your crystal ball?
You know, well, yeah, I took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say this is a crystal ball question, but there's a few factors I think that are fairly common around the world, but they tend to show up at different times. Globally, I think everybody's dealing with higher input costs. So dairy producers around the world need to utilize good genetics to maximize profitability. That's no surprise, but the US has been looking at that. I think other countries, developing countries, are starting to look a little bit more closely at economics of production. But the US has been and should continue to be a leader in the development of genetics that can increase efficiency. I would say another one is there's an increased consumer awareness and expectation for dairy producers to minimize greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the carbon footprint of dairy animals. We've been doing this through genetic progress for decades by reducing the number of cows to produce the same amount of milk or more. So we've been contributing to a reduction in the carbon footprint all along. but we need to do a better job of explaining it. I think consumers are going to also expect and demand good animal husbandry practices to be followed. So we should expect more oversight and scrutiny of how livestock are handled and managed. And then breeding, I think breeding and reproduction programs, they'll continue to evolve to meet the needs of the producer. We expect that, as we talked about earlier, the use of conventional semen will probably continue to decline, and gender-selected units will probably continue to increase. At some point, an equilibrium will be reached for beef on dairy semen as producers make their calculations and figure out how many replacement heifers they need, and then how many animals they can breed to beef semen. Then, just to wrap it up, I think NAAB and our members will continue to look ahead and develop strategies and programs for the future needs of the dairy producers. We're always trying to look 5-10 years down the road on what the needs are going to be to produce the right product for them.
That is perfect. And I'm going to ask you one wild card question here, Jay, because you've spent your career in this space of the industry. And we know there's been so much change in how we sell semen, how we genomically test, how we handle the genetics of our cattle. Throughout your career, what is the piece of technology that has taken you most by surprise in its adoption on farm that has led to the most progress?
I think without a doubt it has to be genomic selection. I've been in the industry for 40 years, and I've always said that in the first 30 years, there were changes, but they were smaller changes. They were not such dramatic changes. It was a change in the model. It was a change adding a few traits here and there, but not a lot of things changed until we got into the introduction of sex-sorted semen or gender-selected semen. That was kind of a game changer compared to the 30 years prior. But now when we come along with genomics and genomic selection, I think that has moved the needle much more than anything else in the past. Sex-sorted semen, beef semen, all that plays a role in it, but I think genomic selection has been the big game changer.
I like ending with that comment because I think you're probably correct. That has been the catalyst that has allowed us to really fine tune so many things. And how do we use that gender selected semen? How do we use that beef semen? How do we manage our cows? Do you have any other comments as we wrap up here, Jay? Anything you want to share with listeners and viewers?
I just appreciate the opportunity to explain a little bit about what NAAB is, what we do. I think there's a lot of dairy producers in the US that don't really know who NAAB is. Our membership is the AI companies, and so the AI companies have the relationship with the dairy producers. So we're kind of in the background. And so hopefully this is an opportunity to make them a little bit more aware and increase the awareness of NAAB and CSS.
Now, the next time they see an NAB or a NAB code on that straw of semen,
Right.
they're going to have a little more appreciation as to where that came from. So, thank
Exactly.
you so much, Jay, for joining us and sharing so much insight on those semen use numbers and kind of some thoughts on how we're using dairy and beef semen here and abroad. It's been great to have you on as a guest of the CDCB CowCast.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the CDCB CowCast. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you are streaming. Questions or comments about the topic covered in this episode can be sent to outreach@uscdcb.com. That's outreach@uscdcb.com. Or you can send us a message at the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to hearing from you and see you again next month.